Let me tell you something about the year 2387 that nobody in the history feeds will bother mentioning. It wasn't a glorious year. It wasn't the year humanity cracked faster-than-light communication, though they'll say it was. It wasn't the year the Compact finally ratified the Seventh Species Accord, though the politicians carved that one into every monument from here to the outer rings. It wasn't the year the Galactic Defense Fleet won anything worth winning. No. The year 2387, from where I was standing, or more accurately, from where I was crouching on a cold metal floor in a medbay that smelled like recycled oxygen and antiseptic resin. That year was the year I met a girl who hadn't stood on her own 2 feet in 5 years. And I mean hadn't stood, not metaphorically. Not in the sense of she'd lost her confidence, or the trauma had grounded her. I mean her legs didn't work, had stopped working 5 years before I showed up, because of something that the Compact's finest physicians had cataloged, documented, filed away in 17 different medical databases across 4 star systems, and then politely declared untreatable. She was a vampire. And I was just some human medic who was too stubborn to read the file properly. This is how it happened. Chapter 1. The Posting Nobody Wanted. Kael'thar Station, Neutral Corridor 14, near the Valen boundary. 6:14 hours, Standard Compact Time. The transport dropped me at Kael'thar at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning, which felt appropriate because nothing good has ever started on a Tuesday morning. Not in my experience. You don't get dramatic beginnings on Tuesdays. You get gray lighting, malfunctioning airlocks, and a bunk assignment that smells like whoever left before you had a very complicated diet. I remember stepping off the lift ramp and just stopping. Not because it was beautiful. Kael'thar Station wasn't beautiful. It was a frontier posting, technically categorized as a neutral corridor medical auxiliary depot, which was Compact bureaucracy's way of saying it was the kind of place they stuck medics they didn't quite know what to do with. The corridors were wide enough for 3 species to walk abreast, but the lighting was calibrated for Valen vision, which meant everything had this low amber haze that made the whole place look like a photograph taken through someone's dirty window. I stopped because of the sound. Or the lack of it, really. For a station that supposedly processed 300 transit beings a day, it was quiet in a way that felt almost deliberate, like the station itself was holding its breath. I adjusted the strap on my kit bag, medical-grade polymer casing, government tissue, nothing special, and started walking. Vorn! The voice came from a side corridor, and I turned to find a woman in a pale gray auxiliary uniform, leaning against the wall with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for years. She was human, mid-40s, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that had that particular quality of tiredness you only get from long postings far from anything familiar. "That's me," I said. "Commander Ilsa Hartwell, Station Medical Director." She pushed off the wall and extended a hand. "Welcome to the end of the line." "Is it that bad?" "Worse," but she said it without malice, more like a statement of weather conditions. "Come on, I'll show you the bay." The med bay was 2 corridors over and down a lift that groaned when you stepped into it. Hartwell pointed out the equipment without enthusiasm. The tissue regenerator, 3rd generation, reliable but slow. The atmospheric modulator kept the air breathable for the 6 primary species in the station's rotation. The pharmaceutical dispensary, which she specifically told me not to touch without clearance, because 3 of the current drug interactions protocols had been rewritten after an incident she declined to detail. Then she stopped at a door at the far end of the bay. It was a private room. That already told me something. Private rooms were for long-term cases, for patients who weren't going anywhere. "Before I open this," Hartwell said, and her voice changed slightly, went quieter, more careful, "I need you to have read the file." "I read the file on the transport." "I need you to have understood the file." I looked at her. I'm a medic, I understand files. Vorn. She turned to face me fully. The patient in this room is a Kelthari, a vampire, as the transit species usually call them, technically a citizen of the Compact under the Fifth Accord. She was admitted here 14 months ago after a transfer from the Valen Medical Institute, and before that she spent 3.5 years at the Kelthari Home System Care Facility on Valdris Minor. A pause. She has been unable to walk since an incident 5 years ago. Her spinal locus, it's not like ours. I need you to understand that it's not our anatomy. Her spinal locus was damaged during the incident. The Kelthari healers tried their methods for 3 years. The Valen Institute tried for another 1.5 years. She pressed her lips together. The consensus is that her neural pathways in the lower locus are irreparably fragmented, too fragmented for regeneration. The Kelthari heal differently, as you'll know from the file, faster than humans in most respects. But when the damage exceeds a certain threshold and the natural healing fails, the body simply maintains the damage rather than worsening it. She won't deteriorate, but the Institute's conclusion was that she also won't improve. I let that sit for a moment. What was the incident? I asked. Hartwell's expression shifted. Something complicated moved behind her eyes. That's in a secured subsection of the file, above your clearance level currently. She paused. What I can tell you is that she was 18 years old when it happened. She's 23 now. 23 years old. 5 years of not walking. 14 months on a station at the end of the line, in a room at the end of a corridor. What am I supposed to do for her? I asked. Honestly, the assignment is observation and support, basic well-being monitoring, making sure the equipment functions properly. She has an atmospheric supplement running 24/7 because Kelthar's standard air mix is slightly wrong for Kelthari physiology, not enough of the trace elements they need. You monitor the mix, you monitor her basic readings, you document. She paused again. You're not here to cure her, Vorn. Nobody expects you to. The posting was vacant because the last 3 medics requested transfers. Hartwell chose her next word carefully. Difficult. Difficult. She doesn't talk, hasn't said a word to anyone on this station since her transfer here. The Valen Institute warned us. She went silent about 8 months into their care. They attributed it to psychological trauma compounding the physical injury. A brief pause. Don't expect conversation. Don't expect cooperation, really. Just keep her stable, keep the equipment running, document, and transfer the monthly reports to the Institute's archive. She opened the door. I went in. Chapter 2. The Girl in the Amber Room. The room was warm. That was the first thing I noticed. Not warm like comfort, warm like a setting, deliberate and precise. The kind of environmental temperature you dial in carefully for a specific physiological need. The amber lighting from the corridor didn't reach far inside. Instead, the room had its own low illumination, a deep bronze gold that came from panels set into the ceiling at angles designed to feel less institutional than they were. She was in the chair. Not a medical chair, or not only a medical chair. It had started as a compact tissue rehabilitation frame, the kind with integrated monitoring sensors in the armrests and the back support. But over 14 months, things had been added. A surface across one armrest that served as a writing desk, narrow, practical, with a data slate on it currently displaying something in Kelthari script. A small metal shelf bracket attached to the left side of the frame, holding 3 objects I couldn't identify from the doorway. The chair itself had been repositioned, not facing the door, not facing the medical monitors on the wall, but angled toward the single-port window on the far side of the room, which showed the dim star field of the neutral corridor, and at the edge of the view, the slow amber-lit edge of the Valen boundary. A gravitational anomaly that sat at the edge of this sector like a scar in space, permanently visible, permanently still. She was watching the window. I'm going to try to describe her the way I saw her then, without knowing what I'd later come to know, because I think that first impression matters. She was slight, not frail in the way the word usually suggests. There was nothing soft about her. Slight in the way very precise things are slight. Her frame was narrow, and her hands, resting on the armrests, were long-fingered and still in a way that reminded me of a figure in a painting. Her hair was dark, Kelthari dark, which is different from human dark. It has an undertone that catches light differently, almost like deep water, and it fell loose to her shoulders, which I mentioned because it told me she'd been here long enough that nobody was enforcing the medical facility guidelines about hair. Her skin was pale in the particular way Kelthari skin is pale. It has a quality of translucence at the edges, around the jaw and the wrists, that doesn't read as sickly so much as different. Like the blueprint for human skin, but drawn in a different material. She didn't look at me when I came in. She didn't look at me for a long time. I crossed to the monitoring station, wall-mounted panel, standard compact tissue, and pulled up the atmospheric readings. Everything was within parameters. The supplement mix was cycling correctly. I checked the mobility frame settings, the temperature regulators, the pressure monitors. Everything correct. Nothing to fix, nothing to adjust. I was very aware, the whole time, of her not looking at me. I pulled the secondary chair, the plain one, the one that was clearly for whoever came to do exactly what I was here to do, away from the wall, and sat down. Not too close, not too far. "My name's Elias Vorn," I said. "I'm the new auxiliary medic. I'll be checking in twice daily, plus on call for anything you need." "Nothing." The star field in the window moved slightly, not the stars, but the station's slow drift rotation. The edge of the VLN boundary traced a line across the bottom of the port. "I'm not going to take up a lot of your time," I said. "I'll do the checks, keep out of your way. If you need anything, you can use the comm on the armrest. It's direct to the medbay. I'll have it with me." "Nothing." I stood, put the secondary chair back where I'd found it. "I'll come back at 1800 for the evening check," I said. I was at the door when I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. It wasn't planned. It wasn't strategic. Something in the quality of the silence in the room, the specific density of it, made me turn back. She was still watching the window. "The Valen boundary," I said. "I read about it on the transport. Apparently if you watch it long enough, you start to see movement in the gravitational distortion. Like patterns. They say it's a cognitive phenomenon, your brain trying to make sense of something that doesn't behave like normal space." I paused. "I don't know if that's true. I've never watched it long enough to find out." I left. I didn't know then that I just said the only thing in a very long time that she'd actually listened to. Chapter 3. The Files SECURED Sections. Personal Log, Elias Vorn, Day 4, Kelthar Station. I'm not supposed to go looking for the restricted portions of her medical file. I know that. But I also know how to read the shape of what's been left out of an official record. And there are shapes in Seraphine Kalindra's file that don't make sense unless you know what's missing. Her name is Seraphine Kalindra, daughter of House Kalindra, one of the 9 Kelthari noble lineages, though I gathered from context that noble in Kelthari society means something more bureaucratic than grand. The house system is about bloodline administrative function, not wealth or prestige in the human sense. She was 18 when the injury happened. The file records the injury as having occurred during a compact military engagement near the outer reach boundary. The engagement known in official records as the VLN Compact Enforcement Action, which is what the Compact's Documentation Division decided to call what everyone else calls the Nightfield Massacre. I found that in a public historical archive, not the medical files. The Nightfield Massacre was 5.5 years ago. It happened at a compact defensive post on the edge of the VLN boundary, the same boundary Seraphine stares at through her port window. Galactic Defense Fleet forces engaged what were classified at the time as insurgent elements. a label that was quietly revised 18 months later to civilian displacement groups, after a compact investigative tribunal concluded that the majority of beings at the Nightfield post weren't combatants. 114 beings were present at Nightfield, 39 survived. In the public record, Seraphine Kalindra is listed among the survivors. No further detail. But I can read the shape of a file. The way her injury, described in medical language as catastrophic multilevel locus fragmentation with associated neural pathway disruption at the lower vertebral meridian, would map onto physical trauma. The kind of trauma that happens when something hits you with enough force and wrong enough an angle that the part of you responsible for everything below your waist simply stops receiving signals. She was 18 years old at Nightfield. She was there. She survived. And when she walked away, and she did walk away, because the injury is listed as having manifested and been diagnosed approximately 4 hours post-event, which means her system kept her functioning through the immediate crisis and then collapsed. When she walked away from Nightfield, she walked for the last time. I sat with that for a while. Then I started rereading the medical file with different eyes. The Kelthari healing mechanism is documented extensively in compact medical databases. Vampires, and I know some of them bristle at the term, but it's used so commonly in xenobiology that it's the easiest shorthand, have a neurobiological system that humans find genuinely difficult to conceptualize, because it doesn't map onto anything in human anatomy. The closest comparison the xenobiological literature gives is this. Imagine if your nervous system could, under ordinary circumstances, rebuild itself from a template. Not quickly, not in the dramatic way of science fiction, but reliably over time the way a tree grows around a wound in its bark. Kelthari neural tissue has this property. Damage heals, usually. The mechanism is tied to what the literature calls the locus network, a secondary neural architecture that runs parallel to the primary spine and brain, and which functions as a kind of biological blueprint reference. The problem, the specific problem with Seraphine's case, and the problem that 3 different medical institutions across 4 years had encountered and declared insurmountable, was that the damage at Nightfield hadn't just injured her primary spinal structure. It had injured the locus network too. The blueprint was damaged, and when the blueprint is damaged, the body's reconstruction system doesn't have a reference point to rebuild toward. It heals, but it heals toward a target it can no longer read clearly. The result is neural pathway growth that is fragmented, that starts in the right direction and then branches incorrectly, like a plant growing toward light it can't quite locate. The Institute's final report used the phrase pathological regenerative fragmentation and concluded that continued natural healing attempts were making the injury structurally more complex rather than better. The recommended course, cease active treatment, maintain stability, prevent deterioration. Do not attempt repair. The repair process itself was the problem. I read that 3 times. Then I went and looked up Kelthari biochemistry from first principles. Not because I thought I was smarter than the Valen Institute. I'm not. I'm a field medic with solid general training and no particular genius. But I've always thought that the way you read a problem matters, and I thought the Institute had been reading this problem as a Kelthari problem, trying to fix it using Kelthari healing mechanisms, working within the biology, trying to get the locus network to do what it was supposed to do. I started wondering what happened if you approached it from outside the biology entirely. Chapter 4, First Conversation. Day 9, 1800 hours. 9 days in and Seraphine hadn't spoken a word. I'd done 18 check-ins. I'd said things at each of them, not much, not forced conversation, just enough to make the room feel less like a holding cell. Observations, mostly. Things I'd noticed. The way the Valen boundaries light changed at certain points in the station's rotation. the particular sound the atmospheric modulator made when it cycled at the end of the hour. The fact that the auxiliary staff canteen served something they called Terran beef stew that bore no relationship to any beef or stew that had ever existed on Terra. At the 1800 check on day 9, I came in, pulled up the monitors, ran the readings, and then sat in the secondary chair. I'd started doing that instead of immediately leaving, just sitting quietly for a few minutes at the end of each check. And I said, almost without thinking about it, "I've been looking at your case file." Nothing, but she was facing slightly more toward the room than usual. A small thing, maybe coincidence. "Not the restricted sections," I added. "I want to be clear about that, just the medical record. The documented treatment history from Valdres Minor and the Valen Institute." A pause. I had some questions about the locus network damage assessment, specifically the Phase 2 regenerative findings. Still nothing. The Institute's conclusion was that the body's own repair mechanism was the problem, that the locus template was too damaged to guide proper neural regrowth, so every regrowth attempt was fragmenting further. I leaned forward slightly. But what they were treating was the regrowth, trying to redirect it, slow it, modulate it. They were working with the Kelthari healing system. A very small shift in her hands, just the fingers. "I've been thinking," I said, "about whether there's a way to approach it that doesn't try to work with the system at all. That treats the locus network damage first, as its own isolated problem, before addressing the pathway fragmentation." Silence. And then, so quiet I almost missed it, a voice. "The locus network can't be treated independently." I went very still. She was still facing partially toward the window. Her voice was low and precise, and had the particular Kelthari vocal quality that the xenobiology files describe as resonant undertone, a harmonic element beneath the primary voice that human ears hear as a kind of weight, a depth that's almost physical. "The locus is integrated," she said, "fully. You can't isolate it for treatment without disrupting primary neural function. That was the first thing the Valdres physicians established." "I know," I said. "But isolated treatment isn't what I was thinking about." A pause. "What were you thinking about?" I felt something loosen in the room, some quality of tension I'd been sitting in for 9 days without fully recognizing it, like a held breath released. "External scaffolding," I said, "not healing the locus, replacing its function temporarily, using something outside the biology as a blueprint reference while the neural pathways regrow." Silence. "That doesn't exist," she said. "Not for Kelthari biology, but—" I stopped, started again. "There's a technique in human spinal reconstruction. It's not commonly used anymore because we have better methods, but 30 years ago it was standard for complex cases. It uses a biosynthetic framework, a kind of external lattice that doesn't interact with the body's own systems. It just sits alongside the damaged structure and provides physical guidance for tissue growth. The body doesn't use it as a blueprint. It just grows in the directions the scaffolding leaves open." The room was very quiet. "That's crude," she said finally. "Yes. It's imprecise. The neural pathways would grow toward the scaffolding openings, but without locus guidance, the growth directionality would be random within the scaffold structure." "Yes," I paused, "but that's better than the current directionality, which is fragmented in 3 dimensions. A scaffold limits the fragmentation to one axis. You still get imperfect regrowth, but it's imperfect in a controlled direction instead of in every direction at once." A longer silence. "Has this been documented," she said, "for Kelthari anatomy?" "No, it hasn't been tried." I looked at my hands for a moment. "I want to be honest with you about that. This is theoretical. I've been running the biochemical projections for 3 days and the numbers look like they should work, but numbers aren't a clinical trial." She turned toward me, fully for the first time, and I saw her face properly, not the peripheral impression I'd been gathering for 9 days, but actually saw her. The structure of her features, the slight asymmetry that Kelthari faces have that makes them look like portraits of themselves. The eyes deep amber red, which is standard for her lineage according to the files, but which in person carries a quality of illumination, like amber glass in light. And the expression, which wasn't what I'd expected. I'd been preparing for hostility or dismissal or the flat exhaustion of someone who'd heard too many promises. Instead, there was something else, something careful and very precisely controlled, the way you'd handle something you were afraid to damage by holding too tightly. "You've been running biochemical projections," she said. "For 3 days, yes." "You're a field medic." "Yes." "This station is an auxiliary depot." "Yes." "You have compact standard equipment." "No specialized xenobiological tools." "Yes." "And you think you might have found something that the Valen Institute, with its complete xenobiological research infrastructure, missed." I thought about how to answer that. "I think," I said carefully, "that the Valen Institute was looking at your biology and trying to work within it. And I think sometimes the reason someone else sees something is just because they're standing in a different place, not because they're smarter." A pause. "I might be completely wrong. The projections might have errors I can't see because I'm not a xenobiologist. I know that." She looked at me for a long time. "Show me the projections," she said. Chapter 5. Galactic Soldiers and What They Don't Tell You. Day 14, 1100 hours. I should explain the political situation, because it matters to what happened next. Kelthar Station sat in a neutral corridor, technically outside the primary jurisdiction of any single compact member species. This made it a convenient meeting point for treaty discussions, transit negotiations, and the kind of diplomatic conversations that both parties wanted to be able to deny having had. In practice, it also made it a place where the Galactic Defense Fleet maintained a rotating patrol presence. Not large, usually 2 or 3 vessels, but enough to remind everyone that the neutral corridor's neutrality was maintained by enforcement rather than goodwill. The patrol rotation for Corridor 14 at that time was assigned to Fleet Commander Tavrek Salindas, a Valen officer who had what I would describe, charitably, as a complicated relationship with compact non-Valen species. Valens are, I want to be careful here because I've met Valens I liked, but Valens have a cultural framework that maps very directly onto a particular kind of institutional superiority. They've been in the compact longer than almost any other species. They pioneered the xenobiological research that made multi-species medicine possible. They built the majority of the compact's early medical and scientific infrastructure. They know this about themselves. They think about it constantly. Commander Salindas had been flagged twice in the compact's internal review system for species conduct incidents. The compact's diplomatic way of describing behavior that would be called bigotry if the perpetrator weren't high-ranking and useful. He'd been transferred to patrol duty rather than disciplined, which is the compact way. On day 14, his ship, the CNS Valen Dawn, a mid-class patrol cruiser, very clean lines, very obviously expensive, docked at Kelthar for a routine transit supply stop. 3 of his officers came into the station during the downtime. I know what happened in the corridor because the station's environmental sensors log everything, and I pulled the log afterward. 2 of the officers went to the auxiliary staff canteen. The 3rd went to the medbay corridor, which makes no sense unless someone had told him where Seraphine's room was. He wasn't one of the patrol officers. He was a fleet intelligence designation. I figured that out later. He was wearing patrol officer insignia, but the register code on his uniform was wrong for patrol, and I'd spent enough time on compact military transports to notice register codes. He stood outside Seraphine's door for approximately 4 minutes. I don't know what he was doing, looking maybe, confirming something. Then he left. I only found out because the atmospheric sensor in Seraphine's room registered a brief corridor pressure fluctuation when the door was approached. It's the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were monitoring obsessively, which, by day 14, I was. I didn't tell Seraphine. Not yet. I didn't have enough information to tell her anything useful, and I didn't want to add paranoia to everything she was already carrying. But I started locking the medbay corridor access. Station protocol allowed me to do that under patient welfare provisions. Commander Hartwell raised an eyebrow when she noticed, but she didn't countermand it. Hartwell, I was learning, knew more about the shapes of things left unsaid than almost anyone I'd met. Chapter 6, SERAFINE Talks. Day 17, evening. We'd been working through my projections for 3 days, Seraphine going over them with a precision that made me realize she'd had significant medical education before Nightfield. She hadn't mentioned it. I hadn't asked. The projection sessions happened in the evenings. I'd bring the data slate and a secondary display I'd rigged from auxiliary parts. I needed a wider visual field than a single slate could provide, because the biochemical mapping took up a lot of space when you laid it out properly. Seraphine would work through the projections methodically, occasionally typing annotations in Kelthari script that she'd then translate verbally. Her voice, once she started using it regularly, had a quality I can only describe as considered. Every sentence felt like it had been looked at from several angles before it was spoken. On the evening of day 17, we'd been working for about an hour when she stopped mid-annotation and said, without looking up from the display, I was a medical student. I waited. At the Kelthari Institute on Valdris Prime, first-year practitioner track. A pause. I was 18. I was on a field observation rotation near the outer reach because one of my instructors had a research contract with the compact defensive post at Nightfield. I kept my breathing even. We were observing triage protocols, she said. It was supposed to be a 2-day observation. Standard xenobiological triage in a multi-species defensive environment. It was relevant to the practitioner track because emergency medicine requires cross-species fluency. She still wasn't looking at me. We arrived on the first day. The observation went normally. On the second day, at approximately 300 hours station time, the engagement began. I didn't say anything. The post was not a combat post, she said. It was a logistics and medical coordination hub. The beings there were administrative, medical, and scientific staff. There were 11 students present, including myself. A pause. The fleet's records described the engagement as a response to confirmed insurgent activity. That classification was later revised, as you may know. I know, I said quietly. 7 of the 11 students survived. I survived because a compact administrative officer, a human actually, pulled me into a storage corridor when the first strike hit the outer ring. Something shifted in her voice, not breaking exactly, but changing quality slightly, the way a material changes when you apply pressure to it. I don't know his name. I never found out. He didn't make it past the second strike. Silence. The injury, she said. It didn't register immediately. Adrenaline response, probably. Or the Kelthari system's crisis function. We have a physiological override that suppresses non-critical pain signals during extreme stress. I walked out of Nightfield. I helped carry another student. I stayed conscious through the evacuation. A pause. And then, approximately 4 hours after the end of the engagement, at the evacuation point, I sat down, and I couldn't get up. I was very careful about what I did with my face. I was very careful not to make it mean anything it shouldn't. I'm sorry, I said, because sometimes that's the only honest thing. She was quiet for a moment. I have been told many things over 5 years, she said, that I was fortunate to survive, that my prognosis was understandable given the complexity of the injury, that I should find ways to adapt and make peace with my situation. Her voice had gone carefully flat. Nobody told me they were sorry, not in a way that felt like it was about me rather than about what they couldn't do for me. I didn't say anything else. After a moment, she looked back at the display. "The scaffold projection in Section 4 has a calibration error," she said. "The biosynthetic mesh density you've calculated for the third cervical locus interface is 16% too high. At that density, you'd get pressure-induced inflammation that would interfere with the regrowth you're trying to encourage." I looked where she was indicating. She was right. "Good catch," I said. "I know." And that was when I understood something about Seraphine Kailindra that the file had not communicated and that Commander Hartwell's briefing had not conveyed. The silence, the withdrawal, the year of not speaking, it wasn't despair exactly. It was more like what happens when an extremely precise and capable mind has been told repeatedly that its problem is unsolvable, and has had to find somewhere to put itself while waiting for that to stop being the defining fact of its existence. She wasn't broken. She was waiting. Chapter 7, The Scaffolding. Day 23 through day 31. Getting the materials was the first problem. Biosynthetic neural scaffold mesh, even the outdated human medicine version I was working from, was not something Kailthar Station kept in its supply inventory. I put in a requisition through the standard compact medical supply chain, using the most technically neutral language I could manage, describing it as supplemental neural support framework, auxiliary grade, for ongoing patient care. The requisition came back denied in 6 hours. The automated system had flagged it as a Category 3 specialized medical material requiring specialist physician authorization. I went to Hartwell. This conversation I remember very clearly, because Hartwell's face did something complicated when I explained what I was proposing, and it went through about 4 different complicated expressions before settling on something that was, essentially, a kind of contained exasperation at herself rather than at me. "You're proposing to use a human medicine neural scaffold on a Kailthari patient," she said. "A modified version. The density and flexibility parameters need adjustment for Kailthari tissue properties, but the base mechanism—" "Vorn," she held up a hand. "I'm not disputing the mechanism. I'm thinking about the authorization chain." A pause. "If this goes through the compact medical system officially, it goes to the Vaillant Institute. They're the coordinating institution on this case. They will review it. And the Vaillant Institute issued the final determination that this patient's condition is untreatable. If I submit an authorization request that essentially says a field medic at an auxiliary depot thinks he's found something the Institute missed," she trailed off. "They'll deny it," I said. "They'll deny it, they'll flag it as irregular, and they will likely escalate to the coordinating medical authority, which will generate a formal review of the patient's case management, which will—" She stopped. Started again. "You've noticed the fleet presence in this corridor?" I had. "Commander Selindas's patrol rotation has been extended twice," Hartwell said carefully. "Normally, a patrol rotation in this corridor runs 6 weeks. We're at 11 weeks. The extension requests have come from Fleet Command, not from Selindas himself, and they've been logged under a case reference number that ties to a compact intelligence classification." A pause. Seraphine Kailindra's case classification. I was quiet for a moment. "They're watching her," I said. "Someone is watching her. I don't know why. I don't have clearance to know why." Hartwell looked tired, the deep kind, the kind that isn't about sleep. "I want to be very clear with you, Vorn. I don't know what's in the restricted sections of her file. I don't know what happened at Nightfield beyond what's in the public record. And I have made a deliberate choice not to know, because the shape of what I can see suggests that knowing more would complicate my ability to do my job." She let that sit. If I authorize your requisition through the official chain, she continued, it generates documentation. That documentation is accessible to the coordinating institutions. It is possible, I want to be precise, I'm saying possible, that a formal treatment attempt on this patient, one that falls outside the established case plan, could attract a kind of attention that would not be beneficial. I looked at her. You're telling me to find another way to get the materials, I said. Hartwell said absolutely nothing. She picked up her data slate and left the room. Day 25. The way I got the scaffold mesh in the end was through the transit exchange. Kaelthar Station processed a significant amount of cargo transit, ships stopping to refuel or resupply, often carrying mixed medical supplies for delivery elsewhere in the compact. There was a standard protocol for emergency medical material exchange, which allowed station medical staff to requisition from transit cargo under immediate patient care provisions, with documentation filed after the fact rather than before. The definition of immediate in the protocol was surprisingly flexible. A freighter came through on day 25 carrying research medical supplies bound for a compact xenobiological outpost in the outer system. Its manifest included a quantity of biosynthetic mesh material, not the exact formulation I needed, but close enough that, with the manufacturing tools in the medbay's auxiliary fabrication unit, I could modify it. The freighter's medical officer, a young Terex named Gress who had the enthusiastic helpfulness of someone 3 months into their first independent posting, was delighted to assist with what I described as an urgent auxiliary patient support requirement. The paperwork was filed. The material changed hands. The modification took me most of 2 days on the fabrication unit, running the density and flexibility parameters through 67 different iterations, until I had something that matched my projected specs within a 2.3% margin. Seraphine had reviewed every modification with me. She'd caught 4 errors I'd have missed. On day 27, I showed her the finished scaffold. It was smaller than you'd imagine, a web of translucent material, lightweight, bioinert, precisely shaped to the anatomical mapping I'd been building from the imaging files and from Seraphine's own detailed guidance. She knew her own anatomy with the precision of a medical student who'd spent 5 years having every part of her spinal locus documented and examined from every angle by experts in 2 different medical systems. She held it carefully. Her hands were very steady. "It's not elegant," she said. "No. The Valen Institute would find it extremely inelegant." "Probably." She turned it over. The ambient light in her room caught the mesh and traced fine lines across it. "If it works," she said, and then stopped. "If it works," I said, "it won't be immediately obvious. Neural regrowth is slow, even with Kaelthari healing rates. We're talking weeks before any functional connectivity develops, possibly longer. And the first signs will be small sensation returns before function, function returns before strength." She set the scaffold down very carefully on the writing surface of her chair frame. "When the Valdres physicians told me the natural healing had failed," she said, "the attending healer said to me, I remember the exact words, that I should understand my situation as a journey toward a different kind of wholeness, that the concept of what I had been needed to be released in order for me to move forward." A pause. "I found this unhelpful." "I thought about that." "Yeah," I said. "I imagine you did." Chapter 8: The Placement. Day 31, 900 hours. Placing the scaffold was a medical procedure, and it required precision that was, frankly, at the outer edge of what a field medic with compact standard equipment could do. But Seraphine was also, technically, a first-year Kaelthari medical practitioner, or had been 5 years ago before Nightfield, and the procedure we designed together used a guidance system she'd helped me build from the station's auxiliary fabrication tools. A real-time tissue imaging array, lower resolution than the Institute's equipment but adequate for our purpose. That would let her see exactly what I was doing and tell me if I was off by even the marginal amounts that would matter here. We'd been through the procedure in simulation 17 times. She knew the protocol as well as I did. The placement took 4 hours and 11 minutes. I won't go through it in technical detail, partly because the technical detail is dense enough to lose the shape of it, and partly because what I remember most is not the procedure itself, but the silences within it. The way Seraphine's voice came through the internal comm as she watched the imaging feed, steady, precise, calling out positioning corrections with the focus of someone who had made an absolute decision not to let hope enter the room before there was something to be hopeful about. Left axis 0.3 degrees. Confirmed. The lateral interface point, it's sitting slightly anterior. Can you adjust? Adjusting. That's correct, hold position. At the 3-hour mark, with the primary scaffold in place and the secondary anchor points being set, there was a long silence, long enough that I paused. Seraphine. I'm here, a brief pause. I was looking at the imaging feed, another pause. It looks like it might actually work. I kept my hand steady. Let's get the anchors placed before we say that, I said. Yes, a pause. Yes, of course. At 4 hours and 11 minutes, the last anchor was in position. The imaging showed the scaffold exactly where we'd planned for it to be, nested against the damaged locus structure, bioinert, introducing no interference, just there. Present. A framework. I stepped back. It's placed, I said. Silence. Now we wait, Seraphine said. Now we wait. Chapter 9, 37 days. Day 31 through day 68. I'm going to compress this because the waiting, while it was important, was also quiet in a way that's hard to convey without it becoming a list of daily entries. The short version is, we waited, we monitored, the imaging showed the scaffold stable. Seraphine's own reporting was careful and precise. She documented every sensation or lack of sensation with medical thoroughness. Day by day, no change. No change. Marginal thermal fluctuation at the L3 locus equivalent marker could be scaffold settling. No change. No change. Day 40. A sensation she described as pressure awareness diffuse lower thoracic region. Not pain, not movement, just awareness of something there. Day 44. Thermal differentiation. I can tell when the room temperature changes below my waist. I couldn't do that before. Day 51. Something twitched, I think, yes, the left indicator muscle, involuntary, but it moved. Day 51 was the first day I saw Seraphine smile. It was small, it was very controlled, but it was real. Day 58. I can contract voluntarily, it's weak. The control is imprecise, but it's there. Day 62. Both sides. The response is stronger on the left. I think the scaffold positioning was fractionally better on that side. We can adjust the right side secondary anchor, I said. Later, she was looking at the imaging feed with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, something unguarded. Later. Day 67. I want to try. Try what? She looked at me. Standing. Chapter 10. The moment. Day 68, 1400 hours. The room was the same room. The amber light, the port window showing the veil end boundary and its slow gravitational distortion, the monitoring panels, the secondary chair in its position by the wall. I'd brought the parallel support bars, 2 horizontal rails at the appropriate height, bolted to floor anchors I'd fabricated specifically for this, because Kael'thar's medbay didn't have anything like this in its equipment inventory. I'd been building them for the last week, quietly in the evenings, in the auxiliary workshop. Seraphine looked at them. You made those, she said. Yes. When? Over the last few days. She looked at them for a long moment, then at me. "If this doesn't work," she said, "I need you to know that the projection work and the scaffold design were genuinely innovative. If the approach is documented properly and submitted to the right xenobiological research channels, it could have applications beyond my case." "I know," I said. "I'll document it either way." "I'm saying," she stopped, started again. Her voice was very precise and very controlled, and underneath the precision was something she was working very hard to contain. "I'm saying that if I try this and my legs don't support me, I want it to have mattered for something. I don't want it to be." "Sarah, fine." She looked at me. "It's going to matter," I said, "either way, but let's find out which way." She took a breath. I positioned her chair alongside the parallel bars. The mobility frame had transfer mechanisms, standard compact tissue, and we'd practiced the transfer from chair to standing position in simulation, accounting for every scenario from full support needed to partial weight bearing. I knew which muscles the imaging showed strongest. I knew which side to weight. I knew the exact sequence. She knew it too. She put her hands on the bars. I was beside her, close enough to catch her, far enough not to crowd the movement. "Ready?" I said. She didn't answer, she just started. The engagement of muscles unused for 5 years is not a smooth thing. It's not the way it looks in the inspirational media segments, where someone simply rises with effortful grace and the camera finds the perfect angle. It's slow. It's uneven. It shakes. The left leg found purchase faster than the right, we'd known it would. Her arms took the majority of the weight on the bars. The imaging sensors on the mobility frame registered her muscle engagement patterns in real time on the tablet mounted at the end of the bars, and I was watching both the tablet and her simultaneously, tracking the data and watching her face. Her jaw was set. Her hands were white-knuckled on the bars. Her legs were shaking, with the effort of supporting weight they hadn't supported in 5 years. And then, slowly, unevenly, with every indicator on the tablet lighting up in the sequence we'd projected, she straightened. She stood. She was standing. The shaking didn't stop. Her grip on the bars stayed tight, but she was upright. Her feet were on the floor, her legs were holding her. Seraphine Kailindra, 23 years old, 5 years after Nightfield, 5 years after every medical institution in reach had concluded that this would never happen, she was standing. She said nothing for a long moment. Her face, I'm going to try to describe her face, and I'm going to probably fail, because there are expressions that faces make when something enormous happens that language isn't quite scaled for. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something older and quieter than either of those. Something that happens when a thing that was taken from you is returned, and the returning is almost too large to process while it's occurring. Her eyes were bright. In the amber light of the room, with the veil and boundary visible through the port window behind her, Seraphine Kailindra's eyes were very bright. She looked at me. "It hurts," she said. "I know." "It's extraordinary," she said. "Yeah," I said, "it really is." Chapter 11, What Came Next? Days 69 through 94. I should be clear about something. Standing was the beginning, not the resolution. Seraphine's recovery from that first moment was not a straight line. It was a map, a complicated one, with difficult terrain and wrong turns in places where the path doubled back on itself before going forward again. The neural pathway regrowth, guided by the scaffold, was progressing. The imaging confirmed that consistently, but progress in biology is not a clean graph. There were days when sensation decreased instead of increasing, because the regrowth process drew resources from established pathways before new ones solidified. There were days when the muscle engagement that had felt like a breakthrough 2 days prior felt weaker, not stronger. On those days, Seraphine's documentation in her medical log was very precise and entirely clinical. I learned to recognize what clinical language meant in her journal entries. It meant she was managing. I didn't try to fix the managing. Managing was what she needed to do. What I could do was keep working. The scaffold was functioning, but its parameters needed regular adjustment as the regrowth progressed. The optimal positioning for scaffold mesh changes as neural tissue develops around it, because you're always trying to keep the structure slightly ahead of the growth, guiding rather than catching up. I built a secondary monitoring protocol. I was getting very good at building things from the station's auxiliary components that tracked the growth rate and gave me projections 4 days ahead, so I could adjust the scaffold parameters proactively rather than reactively. Seraphine reviewed every adjustment. She had opinions about all of them. Most of her opinions were correct. On day 74, she took 3 independent steps. Hands off the bars, no support. 3 steps on the length of her room before her legs decided they'd had enough, and I caught her at the shoulder and steered her back to the chair. She sat in the chair and looked at the floor where she'd walked. 3 steps, she said. 3 steps. They were not elegant steps. No. They were extremely inefficient biomechanically. You'll smooth out the gait pattern as the control improves. A pause. 3 steps, she said again. Not with self-critique, just registering the fact, making it real by saying it twice. The problem with Commander Celinda's. On day 81, the fleet presence in the corridor changed. Commander Celinda's ship had been resupplied and should have rotated out on day 78. Instead, on day 79, it had been joined by a second vessel smaller, categorized in the station's docking log as a compact administrative transport, which was another way of saying it had no visible identification markings and its passenger manifest was sealed. Hartwell found me in the auxiliary workshop on the evening of day 81. There are 4 individuals in the station who are not in the transit registry, she said. When did they arrive? Yesterday morning. Station environmental sensors logged them in Corridor 7. They're staying in the transit holding suites. A pause. They have Compact Intelligence Division credentials. I was notified formally as Station Medical Director because their cover documentation requires them to be logged as medical inspection personnel. I set down what I was working on. They're here for Seraphine. I believe so. The formal pretext of their visit is an administrative review of long-term patient case management protocols at auxiliary stations. The timing is, she stopped. Their review schedule, which was sent to me, includes a formal patient welfare assessment visit to the long-term care patient currently in Medbay Room 7. Room 7, Seraphine's room. Scheduled for when? Day after tomorrow, 1,000 hours. I was quiet for a moment. What do they want with her? I said. Hartwell looked at me steadily. The restricted sections of her file, Vorn. Think about what you know about Nightfield. Think about the revision to the engagement classification 18 months after the event. Think about the fact that the official record was revised, but no accountability proceedings resulted from that revision. A pause. There are beings in the Compact's institutional hierarchy who have reasons to want the surviving witnesses of Nightfield to remain uncomplicated, stable, in manageable care settings. I felt something settle cold in my chest. She's been walking, I said. She walked 14 steps yesterday. She's going to be mobile, genuinely mobile within weeks. I know. If she's mobile, she's no longer a patient in an auxiliary depot. She's a compact citizen with freedom of movement. She can go anywhere. She can talk to anyone. She can pursue the unrestricted sections of her own medical file. She can. I know, Hartwell said again. I looked at her. Can you delay the visit? I said. I can cite patient welfare protocols. Standard examination period for a patient undergoing active treatment. I can give you 48 hours without it looking like anything other than standard procedure. I need 48 hours, I said. She nodded once. She left. I went back to the workshop and worked through the night. Chapter 12, The Confrontation. Day 83, 700 hours. I told Seraphine everything. I don't have a clever framing for that decision. It was the right thing to do, and the right thing to do is usually also the only real option once you look at it clearly. She was a 23-year-old compact citizen with full cognitive capacity and direct stakes in what was happening. Keeping her uninformed wasn't protection. It was the kind of patronizing management that 5 years of being in the care system had already given her more than enough of. I told her about the Intelligence Division personnel. I told her about the Fleet Presence extension. I told her about Hartwell's read on the situation. She listened, she didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. They want to reassess my case, she said. And by reassess, you mean they want to confirm my situation is stable, yes. Stable meaning immobile, meaning maintained in a care setting. Her voice was very flat. Meaning not able to go anywhere or speak to anyone without it being mediated by a care institution. That's my read. She looked at her hands. The Nightfield survivors, she said. Of the 39 who survived, 14 have given public accounts. The other 25 are in various care situations, long-term, several of them on medical grounds that the public record doesn't specify clearly. A pause. I looked them up when I still had unrestricted data access, before my case was transferred to the Valen Institute and my personal communications were restricted for patient welfare purposes. I felt very cold. Restricted, I said. I cannot make outgoing communications from this station, she said. The medical care protocol includes a communication management provision. I was told it was to prevent me from accessing distressing content. She looked at me. I was 18 when I was told that. I was in a great deal of pain and not in a position to argue it effectively. By the time I understood the full scope of what it meant, it was already embedded in my care documentation. My jaw tightened. I can help you with that, I said. Can you? There's a way to route outgoing communication through the station's supply chain system rather than the medical communication network. It looks like a cargo manifest transmission. It will reach wherever you want it to reach, and it won't be flagged on the medical network. She looked at me. Why do you know how to do that? She said. I've been at a lot of frontier postings, I said. You learn workarounds. She held my gaze for another moment. I have a contact, she said, a compact investigative journalist. She covered the Nightfield revision. She gave me her direct contact information before my communications were restricted. I've been holding it in my personal data archive for 3 years. I thought, a pause. I thought I might never actually be able to use it. Write the transmission, I said. I'll route it. 900 hours. The transmission went out at 900. Cargo manifest channel. Destination encoded in the freight routing data in a way that would make sense to a journalist who'd spent 3 years covering intelligence obfuscation. At 9:30, I went to the medbay and helped Seraphine with her morning exercise protocol. At 10:15, 4 individuals in Compact Intelligence Division credentials presented themselves at the medbay entrance. They were led by a Valen officer, tall, immaculate, with the kind of institutional composure that comes from being very certain of one's authority. He introduced himself as Administrator Varric Solon, Compact Medical Oversight Division, and presented documentation for a patient welfare assessment visit. I was very polite. I explained that the patient was in the middle of an active treatment protocol, and that patient welfare regulations required a minimum 30-minute preparation window before any assessment visit. Administrator Solon explained that his documentation, superseded standard patient welfare protocols. I looked at his documentation. I said that I would need to verify the supersession clause with Commander Hartwell as station medical director, and that it would take approximately. Now, Solon said. His voice had the specific quality of someone who was used to that word ending conversations. Of course, I said. And I stepped aside. They went into the medbay corridor. They went to room 7. Administrator Solon opened the door. Seraphine was standing. Not at the parallel bars, in the middle of the room. She'd been doing that, standing without support for intervals, building endurance for the last several days. The longest interval so far had been 4 minutes and 20 seconds. When Administrator Solon opened the door and the 4 Intelligence Division personnel stepped into the room, she was in the middle of that interval. She was standing. She turned toward the door. She did not sit down. I watched Administrator Solon's face. I watched it go through something that a document filed by a compact official would never describe accurately. A sequence of reactions, happening too fast to separate cleanly, that amounted to confrontation with a fact that contradicted a foundational assumption. He had the medical file in his hand, the file that said non-ambulatory, the file that said stable, non-progressive, the file that represented 5 years of institutional consensus. The patient it described was standing in front of him. Administrator, Seraphine said. Her voice was the careful, considered voice I'd come to know, measured, precise, carrying that Kelthari resonant undertone. I believe you're here for a patient welfare assessment. Solon started. I'd like to formally request, Seraphine said, that this assessment be conducted with a compact citizen's advocate present, as is my right under Article 12 of the Fifth Accord. A pause. I'd also like to formally note that my communication rights have been restricted under my care protocol for the past 42 months, and that I am today documenting that restriction as a rights infringement under the same article. She looked at him steadily. I transmitted that documentation at 900 hours this morning. Solon's composure fractured just at the edges, just barely. Your communication access, he started, was restricted without my informed consent, she said. I was 18 years old when it was implemented. I have reviewed the original consent documentation, and I can demonstrate that the standard was not met. A pause. I've had 5 years to review the documentation very carefully. There isn't much else to do when you can't walk. Administrator Solon looked at her for a long moment. He looked at me. I had absolutely nothing useful to say, so I said nothing. He looked back at Seraphine. She was still standing. His 4-person assessment team was doing the thing people do when the situation they've walked into is not the situation they prepared for, rearranging themselves slightly, occupying themselves with their documentation devices, finding reasons to be very interested in anything other than the specific point of conflict. Solon said, we will reschedule the assessment through appropriate channels. Of course, Seraphine said. I'll have my citizen's advocate contact your office directly. Chapter 13 After. Day 94 through Day 112. The journalist Seraphine had contacted was named Marin Yas, and she was exactly the kind of person who would have made Administrator Solon's day considerably worse if she hadn't already been making it worse by the time he walked out of room 7. Marin Yas published her first piece, framed carefully, sourced carefully, carrying exactly the weight that careful sourcing gives a story, 11 days after the transmission. It covered the communication restriction practices applied to long-term medical care patients at compact auxiliary stations, with specific attention to the Nightfield survivor population. It did not name Seraphine directly. Seraphine had asked it not to, not yet. Let it be a pattern first, she'd said. Let it be about the policy. If it's about me, they'll make it about my case specifically and find ways to qualify it. If it's about the policy, it's harder to narrow. She was right. She was usually right about strategy, which, looking back, should have been obvious from the start, given what she'd survived. The Compact Oversight Committee opened a preliminary inquiry into communication restriction practices at auxiliary medical stations on day 103. On day 107, Serafine walked the length of the medbay corridor without support. Not perfectly. The gait was still uneven, the right side still slightly compensatory, the endurance limited to short distances, but she walked it, the full length, on her own. Hartwell was at the end of the corridor. She'd come down from the administrative section, apparently for no particular reason, and happened to be standing there when Serafine reached her. Hartwell looked at Serafine for a moment. "How's the pain level?" she said. "Manageable," Serafine said. "Good," Hartwell made a note on her data slate. "Carry on." She went back to the administrative section. I think that was, in Hartwell's particular way, as close to celebration as she was likely to offer. On day 112, the CNS Vale and Dawn and the administrative transport both left the corridor. The patrol rotation was reassigned. The Intelligence Division personnel had departed on day 86. Kaelthar Station went back to being quiet in the amber light. Serafine sat at her port window that evening, which she still did sometimes, but differently now. Less like someone waiting, more like someone who had earned the right to sit still. She was working on something, the research documentation for the scaffold approach, which she'd been expanding and annotating for 3 weeks. We'd agreed to submit it together to the Compact Xenobiological Medical Research Archive, a joint filing, Vorn E and Kaelindra S, with full methodology and projected applications. "The abstract needs revision," she said without looking up. "You wrote novel application of biosynthetic scaffolding in the opening. Novel is weak. The method is demonstrably unprecedented in cross-species application. Say that." "All right," I said. "And you described the scaffold placement procedure as technically straightforward with adequate preparation." It was not technically straightforward. It required 67 iterations of material modification, 4 hours of real-time guided placement, and 37 days of parameter adjustment. She looked up. "Accuracy matters in research documentation." "You're right," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "I have decided," she said, "to return to the practitioner track when I leave here." I felt something warm move through my chest. "The Kaelthari Institute." "No, the Compact Medical Institute on Terrace Station. They have a cross-species emergency medicine program." A pause. "I was thinking about what you said, that the reason you saw something different was because you were standing in a different place. I think the most useful version of what I know is the version that can work across different places." She paused. "And I was told at some point that I needed to find a different kind of wholeness." The ghost of something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "I disagree with the framing. I intend to find the original kind." Epilogue. The weight lifted. Personal log, Elias Vorn, day 127. She left on a Tuesday. I know, I said nothing good starts on a Tuesday. I was wrong about that. I've been wrong about several things, it turns out, which seems like the appropriate ending to this particular story. The transport was bound for Terrace Station via the Compact Hub at Merle Point. She had a data case with the research documentation, a formal Compact citizens' rights submission that Marin Yass's legal contacts were handling, and the contact information for 6 other Nightfield survivors who had been in communication-restricted care settings and were now, slowly, beginning to have that restriction reviewed. She stood at the lift ramp to the transport. She stood there without support, without bars, without anything but her own 2 feet on the deck plate. I was there to see her off. Hartwell was there too, again, for no particular reason, having apparently found herself near the docking corridor. Seraphine shook Hartwell's hand. She said something in a low voice, and Hartwell nodded once with the efficiency of someone receiving information that had been expected. Then she turned to me. I'd known her for 4 months. 4 months is not a long time, but I've met maybe 3 or 4 people in my life where time worked differently, where the hours counted for more than they usually do, where paying attention and being present meant you covered more ground than calendars suggest. The research submission, she said. I'll file it once you confirm the final abstract revision. I'll send the revision from Terrace. A pause. It may take me a while to settle in. That's fine. She looked at me. Elias. It was the first time she'd used my first name. Thank you, she said, and then with careful precision because she was always precise, not for the scaffold, or not only for the scaffold, for treating the problem as something that had an answer. I thought about the way the file had looked when I'd first read it, the shape of what had been concluded, the weight of 5 years of institutional certainty. It did have an answer, I said. Yes, she said, it did. She turned. She walked up the lift ramp on her own 2 feet. She didn't look back, which felt right, not because she was leaving without caring, but because she was leaving forward. The transport sealed. Hartwell and I stood in the docking corridor for a moment after it disconnected from the station. What are you going to do now? Hartwell asked. Stay at the posting, I said. There's still a full rotation to complete. And after? I thought about the research documentation. The 67 scaffold iterations, the imaging files, the parameter adjustment logs, all of it sitting in the station's archive waiting. There are probably other cases, I said, other medical files that say untreatable when they mean we ran out of angles. A pause. I've been thinking about that. Hartwell looked at me for a moment. I'll put in for your certification extension, she said. You're going to need it. She went back to the administrative section. I went back to the medbay. I sat in the secondary chair, the one that would go back against the wall now, the one I'd pulled out every evening for 4 months, and looked at the port window and the veil end boundary and its slow gravitational distortion. And I watched it for a while. And after a few minutes, I started to see the patterns.